Yeah.
Excellent stuff. So with me today, I have author, writer, editor, critic, and all-round living legend, Ramsey Campbell.
Who says I'm living?
Ramsey, thank you for that. Yeah, so our first question, which is the question I ask everybody, which genre do you write in and how do you define that genre?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, Ashley. And now we get to the professional stuff, I suppose. I write horror. I'm very proud to say it, and I've been now in print for just 60 years, 6 decades of doing it. How do I define it? Very broadly indeed, actually, not least because, not only did I grow up with the classics, having read very extensively in the field in the 50s, and really most of what you could find in those days were the classics, particularly from the public library. But my view of the whole thing was shaped pretty early on by anthologies that took both from within the field, that is writers who specialized in writing horror, and also the many writers who didn't specialize but have done some remarkably good work in the field. So it's actually very difficult, I find, to think of a writer of short stories for adults who has not at least had a go at writing a couple of stories within the field. I mean, Graham Greene wrote a couple of very fine ones. William Faulkner. L.P. Hartley, probably best known for The Go-Between, wrote several dozen, and so it goes on. I mean, W.W. Jacobs wrote, hordes of stories about barging, bargee life. But the thing we all remember him for is The Monkey's Paw, which is, of course, one of the absolute classics of the field. And in fact, Robert Aikman, the great British writer of strange stories, as he preferred to call them, made the point that many writers are remembered now mainly or quite possibly only for their contributions to the field of the uncanny, even though they wrote an enormous amount else. So there's something about the staying power of the field that I sort of find significant. Now, I've not even started to answer your question, have I? Which is, how do I define it? Well, I mean, all the way from the psychological, the spectral, the uncanny, the very reticent and suggestive, the kind of thing that M.R. James excelled in, for instance, the kind of prose that shows you just enough to suggest far worse. And then, all the way up to graphic horror, to like splatterpunk, to what is known as body horror, whether you've fancied, say, Clive Barker or films of David Cronenberg, for that matter. And then beyond that, there is, I suppose, there is a kind of area of the field where people seem to compete at being more disgusting than each other, which is no interest to me as a reader and most certainly not as a writer. But that's my definition of the field. So pretty broad. And if I say that I would fit in novels like for instance, Never Let Me Go, Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go. It certainly seems to me to be a great, I know it's a dystopian novel as well, but I think it's a classic instance of the kind of horror story where it's horrifying precisely because the narrator doesn't think it is. They feel that they're describing just what life is like for them, but we see beyond that. Obviously, I mean, it's a classic method, and it works very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And all the authors that you mentioned before, I think people overlook that. With horror, there's almost there seems to be a hierarchy when you're looking at people being snobbish about writing, and I think erotica and romance, people definitely pee on them from a great height, and sort of like it's just sort of like formulaic and there's nothing happening there. And then I think people move on to horror, possibly the one that's easy to dismiss, and yeah, it seems unfair. It's one of my favorite genres. It's what I read for relaxing in. It's I'm not quite sure why I relax by reading things that stop me from being able to sleep. But yeah,
because you're an aficionado. That's what sets us apart. I mean, there are the people who read horror or see a horror movie and are so terrified they never want to go anywhere near this stuff again. I mean, very few things do that for me now, but or nothing makes me not want to go near again. But very few things get me on that level, apart probably from several of the films of David Lynch. Actually, they get in there where I'm trying to hide, you know. But they are really exceptional. But the point I think is this: that, you know, there are the people who say, "Yeah, I've done that, never again," and there are people like us who think, "Oh God, that was terrifying. Where do I get some more?" You know, and I think that's the fundamental difference.
Yeah, this weekend, my wife and I went to the local fairground, Blackpool Pleasure Beach, and yeah, we're no longer of the age now where we can sort of like sit on the ride and go, "That was awful. Let's do it again." Yeah, which yeah, I'm still suffering for it actually. So, what's your writing schedule?
Well, every day for a start. But then let me be clear, you know, I can do this because I write full time. I mean, for a lot, you know, I didn't go full time until 1973, which was, you know, 11 years after my first professional appearance. It was only because Jenny, my wife, was earning as a teacher back then that we made it at all, because it was another 6 years of not making it as a writer after I'd gone full time before I did. But now I am full time. It's every day. I mean, Christmas, yes. My birthday, yes. If we go on holiday, sure, it goes with me. Particularly if it's a first draft. I try to manage things so that, you know, I mean, for a start, I always write longhand. First draft is always, you know, a Parker pen and an exercise book, and leave the left-hand page blank for more, you know, second thoughts. I mean, early second thoughts before I get to the real rewrite, which I expect you're going to ask me about at some point, that whole method anyway. And I mean, I'm up by 5:30 in the morning. Normally, if I'm writing a new story, a first draft, it'll be that gets me up. It'll be the ideas are starting to waken in my head, and I have to write the damn things down, which I duly do by, you know, with the notebooks I keep by the bed, or, you know, a phone you can use as a notebook these days, obviously, as well. I try, one of the few disciplines I try to impose upon myself is not to think about the wretched thing if I wake in the middle of the night. Because if I start doing that, it will start working. Because my theory, it's probably more than the theory, I think it's probably my experience, is that any new story, it's always working subconsciously, even if you don't know it's doing it, you know, and all you need to do is sort of log on, and then this wretched thing will be waiting for you to, you know, to start scribbling it down, just ideas for it, or phrases or images, you know, developments of the story. And I sort of, well, I go from, I start, fundamentally, I start working 5:30. I'm certainly here at my desk where I'm speaking to you, physically doing it by about 6:30, having, you know, wandered around the house and made a cup of tea and all this stuff. But it's going on then. And then I'll normally go till maybe around about noon on a first draft, and then have a break for lunch. The afternoon I'll be doing, you know, maybe some non-fiction or proofreading or copy editing or whatever, you know, so a separate, or, you know, non-fiction actually is often the thing, a separate process from the process of doing the first draft. And then after that, I mean, let's say it's a novel for the sake of argument. That just, once that's completed, the first draft, I don't normally read through it until it is completed. Then it sits for some months, and I go back to it and can see it, you know, with something like a new eye. And at this stage, I pretty well always see that, you know, there are many things are wrong with it. Many things need to be fixed, or many things need to be improved. But I can't really see how to do that. Well, I may have the odd, you know, afterthought of a phrase or a sentence, but the whole thing, no. And then when I come to the rewrite, which is onto the computer, onto the screen, a wholly different mindset comes into play, and then this sort of ruthless self comes into being. And I take great delight in, you know, cutting as much as possible, or rewriting, changing as much and improving as much as I possibly can. And in general, I'd expect to come out with about 20% shorter, maybe 25% shorter in the final draft than it was in the first.
Do you find then that writing longhand, it's a different relationship between your brain and the words than you would get if you went with your first draft straight to a keyboard?
I think it is, but I don't know what it is. I couldn't tell you because, I mean, just to contradict, not to contradict, but to elaborate, the non-fiction, I do want it straight onto the screen almost always. It's the fiction that has to be done longhand. I've no idea why. Maybe it's just a lifelong habit. Could be that. I mean, there've been just a couple of stories I have done direct onto the computer. There was one I wrote called "A Street Was Chosen," which is in the form of a report of an unspecified experiment in well, sort of basically directing human beings, you know, which is written entirely in the passive voice, which you're never supposed to do. The characters have no names at all. They simply have letters and numbers to identify them. And the entire thing is just a report of this experiment, whose nature gradually becomes apparent through the, you know, through the nature of what is being reported. And I couldn't do that on, I couldn't write that longhand. So I tried it for a couple of days, couldn't do it. And so I went to the computer and found I could. So presumably it needed that other mindset to authenticate that particular narrative.
There's so much going on behind our spectacles as we write these things. It's
thank you. As a title for a collection, Behind the Spectacles. I shall credit you.
Brilliant. Yeah, I look forward to that. So what's more important to you? Is it plot or character?
Oh, I think probably character, but it's difficult to. It's a juggling act, you know. That they tend to take form simultaneously, particularly if it's a novel again, or a short story for that matter. There's that ghastly sort of stage of the limbo stage of creating a story where, you know, I don't know what the characters' names are, I don't know what they do, I don't know really what the events of the story are going to be, other than a very basic sort of, you know, some ideas for what may happen. And then these things gradually clarify out of this ghastly brain fog. And often enough, you know, as I say, the two will interact actually, and it'll be because one is coming clear that the other comes clear as well. But what I do certainly want is that the plot should express the characters. I want things to happen for a reason, and that's usually kind of rooted in character. Very often, you know, that happens because that person would do this, and it's a process I very much enjoy. I don't plot in advance, I have to say. I mean, even for a novel, I gather a lot of material, and when I seem to have enough of it, you know, the whole thing seems to be straining to be started, then, you know, I'll give it a go, and then gradually the thing will develop itself as I go along. I mean, I'm a great believer in the organic process of narrative, you know, to have the whole thing work itself out in terms of its own logic. And I mean, I have, you know, after so many decades, I've kind of relaxed enough with the process that I can let that happen, which again seemed to be, you know, coming back to this whole notion of letting the subconscious play, if you like.
Do you ever find that with the organic approach to writing that you've got unfinished manuscripts because of that? Ideas that sort of like started off where, yeah, everything seems to have fallen into place, and then I mean, for me, it's about the 40,000 word mark where you think this is going nowhere, I'm hiding it in a drawer.
Yes, I think I get that feeling quite often around that point, yeah. But thank God, since I was in my early teens, I haven't actually abandoned the novel. I've abandoned maybe half a dozen short stories over the years, but a novel, no. I mean, the reason that, you know, I do, but I get exactly what you're saying. I do get that experience quite often. It's like being sort of in the middle of a desert with no knowledge of how you got there, and no idea where the devil you're going either. But I always find that, and this I found, again, this comes back to this whole organic process thing, that if I go back and look over the rest of the narrative as it so far exists, usually there's something in there, and it may have been something that I thought I put in as a background detail that is now the seed of what I need now. And even though I didn't know it was going to be so significant, it turns out to be. And, you know, I managed to trust myself on this. But there have been a couple of instances, well, over the last, I don't know, 10 years, maybe 20 years, where I have thought, in the middle of a novel, I've seriously thought, I've lost it. You know, I really don't know what I'm doing anymore. I'm really going to have to give this one up. But no, thank God, not yet.
What piece of writing advice would you give to anybody who's just starting out?
Oh, gosh. Well, basically, you know, do your absolute best to finish what you start, you know, finish that story. and even if it feels clumsy, if it, it feels you haven't done what you wanted to set out to do, that is the boon of rewriting. You can always rewrite. I think if you keep that in your mind, that this is not the final version. I mean, obviously you don't want to get into the sort of the old thing in what is it, La Peste, the Camus, where the novelist who can't get beyond his opening sentence because he's too busy polishing it. But certainly, rewrite as much as you feel it needs, and that horrible sort of jagged thing that is the first draft. It's going to be better than that when you finish, but you must, I think, finish it before you rewrite. I would not myself recommend rewriting an uncompleted piece, although I've known my old friend Bob Shaw, the science fiction writer, he used to rewrite each chapter of his novel as it was done and then move on to the next one. I mean, I couldn't do that because it seems to me that there are changes that might be made in the earlier part of the narrative by the later developments, and if necessary, that's what I'll do. So I don't want to feel that the earlier part is fixed. I want it needs to be sort of fluid in case it needs to incorporate later thoughts. One trick, if you like, that I have learned, and one of the very few works for me, so people might see if it works for you, is always to compose at least the first sentence of a session before you sit down to write, because then you've got something to write. And I find always something will come out of that, and out of the sentence comes the paragraph, out of the paragraph comes the page, or however much you do a day. I mean, I don't set myself any kind of target, but I tend to average about 500 words a day, as did Graham Greene, apparently. I think actually he apparently did 500 words a day. Whether that meant he went 499 500 stop, even if it was in the middle of a sentence, I do not know. I wouldn't quite do that, but I would say probably certainly finish writing on your session when you begin to feel you're running out of creative energy, but possibly stop a little earlier than that even, so you've got something to come back to the next time you come back to it. And if you like, I always think, rough out what you're going to write next, because you don't have to stay with that, but you've got some idea of what you're going to develop next. And of course, I would say, if you can, write every day while you're working on a new piece. Now, if you can't, okay, but then do it as often as you possibly can. But have that sense of needing to get to it, as soon as you can next. Because the one thing the one time I ever had writer's block was when I decided, well, no, I don't feel like it today, having done the first day's work or so on a short story. And the next day I felt even less like it, and that went on for 6 months. I couldn't get back into that wretched story. The only way I could do it was actually by writing, the line was, that's how the story starts, or this is. So, I basically started off again. What I should have done was incorporate that early stuff in the body of the narrative, but I actually left it there just to remind myself of just how dreadful, a writer's block could be if you let it happen. So far, never again.
Yeah, I completely get that. I mean, with writer's block, yeah, the whole notion of it terrifies me that it's going to get there. But I go to the gym on a morning, and I know that I've got to force myself to go there. But I know if I don't, in that case, one morning not going, in that case, the next one will be a case of, screw it again. And absolutely, it would be so easy to lose that. So who do you read for pleasure?
Oh, good Lord, where do I start? Just at random, Nabokov, who was actually my great epiphany as a 17-year-old. I read Lolita, and it was just opened up so many of the possibilities of language and narrative that I immediately went and grabbed everything else of his I could find. I mean, Pale Fire equally is a jaw dropper. It's, if people don't know it, it's a comic suspense novel in the form of a 999 line poem and a 300-page commentary on the poem. I mean, if you can't imagine how that could possibly work, well, I'm not surprised. All you could do is go and read it and find out for yourselves. I mean, I do read within the field, particularly the classics still. I mean, I'm always coming back to Lovecraft, actually, and to M.R. James, and to Aikman, to Shirley Jackson, you know. But I mean, there are so many of the newer writers. I won't start naming, because otherwise at the end I'll know perfectly well, oh my God, I forgot to name them, and I'll be horribly embarrassed. But I do think we're in another golden age of the field, actually, of my field. I mean, I think, you know, there are an extraordinary number of major talents out there, some of them in the independent press. I mean, a few are publishing themselves, but I mean, they generally speaking of people who started in traditional publishing and decided they could do it better for themselves. Oh, but who else would I read? Oh, I mean, Graham Greene is an enormous favourite. Very fond of Kingsley Amis. Elizabeth Jane Howard, I very much like. You could spot Robert Aikman in there if you look closely, by the by. Gosh, who else? Iris Murdoch, I've always been fond of. Anthony Powell, Melville, Joyce. Just a few, and incidentally, if people just thought that I said Joyce to be pretentious, no, actually, Ulysses is one of the most fun novels to read of any I know. Now, I don't get all the Irish history, I've got to say, but there's so much in there to enjoy besides that. I mean, I once took it on a beach in Greece, and I enjoyed it all over again. So Finnegan's Wake, no, I'm still yet to tackle Finnegan's Wake. But given the humility and senility, whichever I'm going to need, maybe I'll try that one day.
Well, with Joyce, I mean, I might actually try looking at Ulysses at some point. I made the mistake of trying to read Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man. Yeah, I got about 3 lines into that, and then thought all of this cockadoodle, yeah, it was just too much.
Oh no, it settles back into, or settles down into conventional narrative very shortly after that. Give it another shot. Give it another shot. I mean, I'll tell you, by page 2, I think you'll be okay. I mean, good Lord, you've read The Sound of the Fury? No, maybe you've not. Maybe not.
Is that Faulkner?
Yes.
Yes,
that's the one. Yes. I mean, that's more difficult than the Portrait of the Artist. Dear me. Gosh.
Maybe I was in a funny mood that day.
You must have been. Yeah. You must have been. Yeah. Yes, there's another writer, Faulkner, I'm very fond of, actually. Yes. Yeah, he's a very. And I've now got The Sound of the Fury with the special coloured ink edition, so you can, which was how he wanted it to come out in the first place, you know, so you could actually see where the time shifts are. Wow. And each one's in a different coloured ink.
Right. So yeah, it's delightful that you've got such a long list of people that you read for pleasure, because sometimes I've been talking to people who don't have time to read for pleasure, or
oh yeah, well, I mean, I must admit I used to read more than I do, but I think that's just age slowing me down, honestly. But oh yeah, I wouldn't good Lord forbid we should ever give up reading. But then there's classical music I've got to listen to, movies I've got to watch, you know. The day is too short, basically.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm doing at the moment is I'm going through a lot of audiobooks, just because I can
yes,
pick an audiobook on, go to the gym, and or when I'm out driving, and yeah, and obviously I'm a danger to other road users as well. But I'm enjoying my story. So you said, or somebody said about you, one of your earliest influences was H.P. Lovecraft. What is it about Lovecraft's fiction that's captured your imagination and held your interest?
Well, originally it was just this enormous cosmic vision, you know, the sense of something so large that the narrative couldn't encompass it, except as a kind of metaphor, which you also get in Alton and Blackwood, you know, a story like The Willows or Mac and the White People. I mean, I think, you know, Lovecraft was influenced by them and by Poe, but he took all his influences and basically subsumed them into something very personal, which kind of melds supernatural horror and science fiction, or he used to call it weird fiction, which is probably a good term to, you know, to encompass the whole. And that's what got me originally, just this you know, the sense of vast, you know, the vastness of the universe and the terrors therein. What still keeps me coming back to him, though, is, I mean, there's often this parody notion of Lovecraft as being, you know, a writer of purple prose, who always said, you know, things were indescribable, and that was your lot, and spent a paragraph saying how indescribable they were, which is just not true. There are a couple of stories, yes, where he uses a device of that kind, But there are far more where he does nothing of the kind, where you know that you have a very specific notion of what his monsters are like. But in other cases, you know, something like The Color Out of Space, it's not it's indescribable. It's that he alludes throughout. It's an elusive method, which is a quite different thing. But the two things about Lovecraft, I come back to again and again, are actually in his best work is the modulation of the prose. I mean, far from being purple, it's very well. Fritz Leiber used to use the term orchestrated about and I think that exactly fits. You know, the prose is orchestrated. It's gradually developed, and the selection of language is, in his best work, is second to none. The other thing is the care with structure, the gradual, accumulation of detail. And I think the one thing that Lovecraft does pretty well certainly as well as anybody else and better than most, is there's one thing about the horror story where you very often, I think you have to shift from the inexplicit to the explicit, from suggestion to showing, I mean, you find this in M.R. James, another master of exactly that. But again, Lovecraft does that shift really better than almost anybody in his best work. And I'm basically still feel I'm still learning from him, still happily take his example, develop it in my own way anyway.
I've got to admit, one of my favourite Lovecraft stories, the Herbert West ones.
Yes.
Wonderful. They're sort of like, maybe not dismissed by critics, but they're seen as being sort of like not his best work. Yet I love Herbert West as a character. I just think he's so horrible but committed to his craft. I like the tension that's built within those. And I get what you're saying about it feeling orchestrated, because
I mean, he actually, it's interesting because I mean, Lovecraft did do those as a sort of, almost an assignment. He had to do 6 stories, and I remember it for a little magazine before he really started selling to Weird Tales, which actually didn't then exist, if I'm not getting the chronology wrong. They are early work, and he didn't regard them highly himself. But as you say, I think there's a lot going on. By gum, they're stuffed with incident. And also there's a real vein of black humor. I mean, there's that great line, "Damn it, it wasn't quite fresh enough," which, is a straight-faced, gag worthy of Ambrose Bierce, I think.
It's beautiful writing, and it's just got such a wonderful, sinister feel about it, which, if I was reading something that was going to sort of like disturb my sleep for an evening, it would be, sit up late and, read Reanimator. You are one of the world's most celebrated writers. You, amongst your many accolades, you've received the World Fantasy Awards Life Award, the Spanish Premio Sheridan Le Fanu Award for Career Achievements, the Living Legend Award from the Horror Guild, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Horror Writers Association. Do these awards and accolades place you under personal pressure to make your next piece of work all the more remarkable?
Well, I hope it's to some extent remarkable. That's my hope. I don't know how I'm doing it, but no, seriously. I mean, no. When I'm writing a piece, all I'm aware of is the piece. And the pressure is of the sort of unwritten prose and the untold story, and that's all I'm really aware of. It's not even that I have to focus on it. It focuses me, if you see what I mean. It preoccupies me, if not possesses me. And to be honest, I'm not aware of anything but the process. And no, not the awards at the time. I mean, I'm very happy that people think so highly of me. It's very kind of them. But no, I just want to write some more, man. That's brilliant, and do better than last time.
I was going to ask that. Is it part of because it's one of the things that I find myself doing when I get to the keyboard, thinking, the last story that I've just finished was good. This one needs to be gooder.
Yes,
when I'm writing it, but and I think it's something about storytelling where, if we know we've impressed an audience with one story, we don't want to leave them flat with the next one.
No, oh no, gosh, no. And I try not to repeat myself. That's the other thing. I'm not saying I never do, because I've got recurring themes. I know that, but I try to, at least to do it something different each time. Even there, perhaps I fall short, but doing my best.
My penultimate question for you is, you've written long and short fiction throughout your career. What's the difference? Which do you prefer and why?
Well, I mean, basically short stories are about what you leave out, or about leaving out as much as you possibly can. Novels are very compendious, and for me, a lot of fun, because you can then put in, a lot of what you would like to put in. And I do find that a novel gains more impetus, it actually, more momentum, basically, from the pressure of events, the gradual development. So, I mean, for me, I suppose the novel is what I most enjoy writing, but I certainly wouldn't give up the short story. And, I've always got more short story ideas than I know what to do with. And indeed, I'm between novels right now, or actually, to be more precise, I'm between first and final drafts of a new novel. So I'm doing several short stories to fill in, or to give myself something to do. But I want to do them, and I would never, I hope I would never abandon that form either, because there are things you can do in that you can't really do in the novel. But equally, there's certainly things you can do in the novel that you couldn't do in a short story or a novella, which is a very interesting form too. And I've had a few goes at that of late.
Do you ever find that short story ideas, you've got an idea for a short story, and it expands into either a novel or a novella?
Not really. Way back there was a short story, this was back in the 70s, which turned into a science fiction novella, but it wasn't very good because, frankly, my very few attempts at science fiction are not very good, But it did kind of bulk itself out. And of course, the famous one, not me, but the famous one, I'm sure you know this, is Stephen King's The Mist, which started life as a short story. Our agent, sadly now no longer with us, Kirby McCauley, asked Steve to write a story for Dark Forces, this anthology. And Steve rang him up a couple of days later and said, look, Kirby, this is going to be about 30 pages. That's not too long. He said, no, that's fine. Another phone call a couple of days later, well, look, this is up to 60 pages. Can you take this? And eventually it ended up as 100 pages, or I think more like 120. The Mist, and we wouldn't have a word shorter, believe me.
Well, yeah, and I remember reading Dark Forces as well when it came. George R.R. Martin was in that anthology as well, wasn't he?
I'm sure he was. Yes, I'm sure he was.
But
he was another of Kirby's clients, and in fact, it was Kirby who said, "Listen, George, why don't you do these, short stories of sword and sorcery stories into a novella, and you may guess what series of novels, uncompleted as of now, that eventually turned out to be."
Wow. Wow. My final question: what are you currently working on, Ramsey, and where can we find more of your work?
Oh, well, let me see. The first question, as I say, a few short stories, but I've done the first draft of a novel called The Lonely Lands, which kind of surprised me in a variety of ways. And that's what, I like to surprise myself. That's one thing I come to my desk every day to try and do, is that in the process of the writing. I want to write things I didn't know I was going to write till they came up. Now, I had said, because this question started coming up not just to me but to writers generally, I think a couple of years ago, must we address the pandemic in our fiction? And my thing was no, because look, when you think about it, you don't find much Spanish flu in Virginia Woolf or Hemingway or Fitzgerald and so forth. It's surprisingly difficult to find fiction immediately post Spanish flu that talks about it, and people obviously just decide to carry on writing about, well, as if it hadn't happened, either before it happened or whichever parallel world you think these things are happening in. And so I thought, well, no, for a start, I thought it might be exploitative, and I certainly didn't want to write something just to be writing about COVID. But oddly enough, eventually it became apparent to me that, yes, as a background to this novel, it was extremely relevant. In fact, it was pretty well the precipitating factor. And so I did end up writing a novel set in the time of COVID, although a lot of it takes place somewhere else, which I won't tell you about. You must wait and see the novel, when eventually it comes out, which will be, I suppose, next year. And I'm also, doing short stories. I'm putting the final touches to, dare I tell you, a 70,000-word monograph on the Three Stooges, called Six Stooges and Counting. which is a personal view of their films, basically, and their surely what is the strangest career of any comedy team in Hollywood, because of the way the personnel kept changing, you know, strangely incoherent. Well, I mean, two of them remained throughout, Moe and Larry, but otherwise, you know, you had four other at different times, four other third stooges, if you see what I mean. Much more than that, but you'll have to wait and see why I find traces in not only Evil Dead but Stanley Kubrick, and what Quentin Tarantino has to do with it all. But watch this space. That's coming soon.
That can't come soon enough for me. Yeah, the Three Stooges were hilarious. They still are hilarious. Yeah, I can watch their films. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Fair enough. Well, yeah, I've got one. I've still the copy, obviously. That's
yes,
good to hear.
Yeah. And if the next one's about Laurel and Hardy, in that case, you sold another copy because they were.
Yes, a great favourite. Yes, absolutely.
Ramsey Campbell, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your information. My students are going to love that.
Ashley, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.